Hey there, welcome to Board Game Hot Takes. My name's Tim.
And this is Chris.
This is Adam.
And today, instead of giving a hot take review on a game we just finished playing, we're going to be talking about some board game definitions. We're going to be going into the explanation for some terms that you might hear us use frequently, but more importantly, we're going to tell you what they mean to us and what we mean when we are using them. We're going to give some examples of games in those categories and that match those definitions. And we may not even agree with each other on this, but we'll see how it goes. Before we get into that, though, I have a poll question, and it's related to this topic. So the poll question I asked on our social media channels was, do you use terminology when discussing or teaching board games that you don't ever use in other areas of your life? The options I gave, yes, frequently, got 54%. Yes, occasionally, got 42%. No, I never needed to, got 1%. And no, board game jargon is awful, got 3%. So 96% of the people that responded to this poll said they have to use unique terminology. And that's why we're doing this show. That's why we wanted to talk about some things. Oftentimes, we'll just throw out a term for a game that makes probably perfect sense to most of you listening because you listen to other board game podcasts or whatever. But we do have people that are joining into the hobby regularly that may be listening to us as a new entry to the hobby. And they're going to be like, what the heck are you talking about? But again, even for those of you that know what this terminology is, why this was useful for us to get into was because I think we, like language evolves. And I think the way these terms were originally intended or how they came about don't necessarily apply today in the same way. So we're going to kind of share with you what we think about them, how we use them, what we mean when we're saying them. So how did you guys answer this poll question?
Tim, I would answer this one. It depends on my audience. So like if I'm going to teach a game to you guys and I know that certain terms fit what I think they mean exactly, then I'm going to throw those terms out because I feel like you guys are going to know what I mean. If I'm teaching a game to Sarah, for instance, and she was thinking about, I told her the idea for the show and she's like, what the heck does 4X mean? So I probably wouldn't, use the term 4X to describe a game to help me teach it. Or she was asking about tableau building. She's like, is that just your stuff that you have? Like, what does that mean? I was like, no, not exactly your stuff. It's like when you got, so it depends on the audience as far as the terms that I'm going to use to explain the game. At least in my head, that's the way I'm going to try to teach it.
Yeah, and I do the same thing as Adam. Generally speaking, if I'm talking to people who would understand the terminology, the answer is yes. And chances are, if I'm talking to people who aren't familiar with the terminology, I'm probably not talking to them about board games anyway. So I think that works out pretty well. And I can totally understand how, certain terminology can seem really obnoxious to a group of people that don't engage in a hobby. Like the couple of times that I've said polyomino to people who were not gamers, I think they looked at me like I had 5 heads. But just like with any specialty, having precise language that saves you a bunch of words can be really helpful. So worker placement is a lot more simple to say than a game where you put a worker in a certain place to do blah, 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 whatever. So I think it can be really helpful, and I use it when I think it's appropriate.
Well, here's how some listeners answered. So Ray Meyer said, absolutely. It's why I hate people trying to change language when everyone knows what a term means versus some term that two people think is more palatable. Aaron Freya said, I would never say this in real life. It's a streamlined dry Euro with set collection, tableau, engine building, deck building, and area controlled troops on a map with minis. I want to play that game, actually. That sounds fun. Yeah. Over on our Blue Sky account, Never Say Die said, being a UXer, discussions about mechanics and components haunt my every day. What I don't get to talk about very often is meeples. Pretty unique to the territory. And then Aaron over from the Boards Alive podcast said, absolutely, I've never used the term orthogonally outside of board games. So it clearly, lots of unique terminology here. So let's get into a little bit because it's funny that already in this conversation, just this kickoff here, I've heard a couple things said that I don't necessarily agree with the same way that you guys think that they apply. So we'll have to see how this comes out today. We're going to be covering 5 terms today and mentioning one game each for that terminology, but also kind of explaining our definitions of them. So let's just jump right in. The first term that we're going to talk about today is worker placement, which Chris already mentioned briefly. Now, I wanted to try to get like an official definition on these, and the official source for board game terminology seems to be Board Game Geek, but this was pretty tricky to do because some of the terms we're going to mention aren't listed as specific mechanisms. The ones that were had like a half a page of text. So I tried to, where I could, try to maybe kind of summarize the best I could, the way that Board Game Geek put it. and then I'll kind of add to what I think has evolved there a little bit. So I'll kick it off here, and then Adam and Chris are going to jump in and tell me what they think, if they agree with me or not. So with worker placement, the way I look at worker placement is it's generally a menu of options. Generally, they're laid out on a central board. And the way you choose that option is using a token, generally represented by some type of worker that's going to go out there and do that action. And then generally, I'm saying generally a lot because it can vary a little bit, but generally that spot is then blocked. If one person gets to do it, the next person doesn't. There are variations on this. Sometimes that spot gets more expensive for the next person. Sometimes there's a positive benefit for the person who went there first if somebody else takes it. But the general idea being that you have to make decisions among this menu of options using tokens to indicate which decision you made. That's worker placement to me. I think the reason why it's called worker placement is because typically some kind of worker is used to represent it. But I was thinking of some games like Underwater Cities, which really is a worker placement game, but it's represented by doors. Doors are what covers over the action you can take. So not really workers, but that's pretty generally how it's used. The game that I picked for this category, which I think is the most straightforward worker placement that matches this definition, and that's A Feast for Odin. Feast for Odin is not one of my favorite games, but it is clearly just a big menu of actions. And if you put a worker there, it blocks everybody else from using it for that round. And so to me, that is pretty much worker placement in a nutshell, the most standard form of it.
That's a good pick, Tim. For each of these terms, I try to come up with as succinct a definition as possible. Probably pretty broad, but I'm going to throw it out there and then I'll narrow that down. So for worker placement, I said it's an action selection with a priority element. And that's it. You're choosing what you're going to do on a turn, and there's either some benefit that comes with that, or you're not going to be able to do that later, or you're blocking that out from somebody else. So you're choosing what you want to do, and it's because that's most important to you to get that done first, because that action might not be available to you later in the round, or it might cost a little bit more, or you might have to spend some extra resources or go to some other part of the board to do it. So to me, that's what worker placement is. And a couple examples of this, I think Anachrony is a fantastic one, and it has some nice variations on this. So you're putting your worker out there in a little mech suit at the beginning of the game more often than not to go to a spot that's going to give you some resources or give you access to build a building or give you access to some research, something like that. And then once that spot's gone, it's going to cost other people a little bit more to go and do that. And that spot won't be available the rest of the round. So I think Anachrony has a very neat way of doing that. And then I was also going to mention another twist on that. I hope I'm not stepping on Chris territory here, but Barrage. This is a game that is kind of a worker placement and an action point hybrid. You get 12 workers at the beginning of your round, and you can go to the spot here. And if you're the first one to go there, it's usually the cheapest time to go there, and it's going to have the least amount of workers to go there. Now, if Chris wants to go there on his turn, he's probably going to have to spend either more workers or a little bit extra cash to do that exact same action that I just did. So I think Barrage is neat because it is this sort of action selection. What the heck does action selection mean? Well, I guess we're going to talk about that on another show, but it's this hybrid of worker placement and action point management that I think is fantastic. Walks a nice line there with Barrage.
You knew that Adam was not going to let this show pass without Barrage being mentioned today. But no, actually, I wanted to mention Anachrony. That's an interesting one you called out, Adam. But the fact that at the beginning of the game, you are using the central board, but then later you're kind of placing workers on your own tableau. Do you guys think that, maybe we shouldn't mention any weird terminology without describing it tonight. But
I know, right? How we should have started the foundation and built up. It's hard.
You got your own group of spaces that you're going to build out on your map over the course of the game, but you're not blocking anybody else. So do you still consider that worker placement when it's on your own map? Because an example that has come up before is called worker placement is Orleans. And that one is it's action selection where you put tokens on your own player mat, and that's it. No, nobody else can block you. But I've never really thought of it as worker placement. But from that description, it would match up with what Anachrony does towards the end game when you're using your own player map.
That's a good question, Tim. I think Anachrony does it enough to call it worker placement because some of those buildings or locations that you're building on your own player board can only be accessed by certain types of workers. So again, you have to prioritize if you want to use this worker up here on the main board to block out a key space, or if you're just going to put it on your own personal board, maybe that's your only worker of that type. So there is a bit of a choice there where you want to use that worker.
So to me, I think that would be worker placement, but it didn't really meet exactly what I would define it as in the most orthodox sense. And that goes to how I approach this list. I think there's kind of an orthodox definition of each of these. And for me, my version probably adhered more closely to the one Tim said than the variation that Adam did. But that doesn't mean that something else can't be worker placement. It just means that there's the orthodox definition versus the offshoots, and there's going to be a million different offshoots. Because, when I was looking at this list, I thought about worker placement, and I was thinking to myself, this is probably about as ubiquitous a characteristic in games these days as you can get. I mean, there are obviously games that don't have any kind of worker placement, but it is so common in so many different kinds of games that it's almost hard to think of a game off the top of your head that doesn't have some variation of worker placement. I mean, look at Eclipse, for example. That's not a game you think of as a worker placement game, but you do actually have worker placement. You're placing these discs into a space that's going to let you take a certain action. Now, there's no limitation on that, and it's on your own board, so that's not exactly what you'd call orthodox worker placement, but there is some variation of that. So when I came up with my list, I came up with what I considered to be the most on-point, perfect orthodox, I'm going to say orthodox a lot of times tonight, orthodox example of what a particular term means, and then some offshoot on that, maybe that does something a little bit different, but is also a lot of fun, and it falls in that same family.
Can I jump in really quick, though, too, and just mention that that's kind of the whole point of this conversation, is that this terminology has evolved, and partly that's evolved because when the terminology first came about, when somebody invented it, there was a very limited number of games that you could even reference, and so you could say, hey, this is worker placement because that's the example that was there. But with board games, like, they're always stealing from each other. They're always evolving off of previous designs. And so I think a lot of the terminology that we think of as what Chris is saying, the orthodox explanation, has evolved, and it's just changed because other games have adapted it in different ways. So I think that's great to call out, Chris.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about how these things have evolved. And there's a couple terms we're going to be talking about, one in particular that I'll get into when we get to it, where I think it has evolved so much that the term is almost irrelevant at this point. So, but I'll leave that to later. For worker placement, I won't repeat what you said, Tim, but I did want to comment that the focus for me I saw the emphasis when I thought about my definition was a competition for the spaces, and generally that those spaces are limited. So really the tension in the game comes from we're competing for these different worker placement spaces. And the game to me that best illustrated the orthodox version of that mechanism was, and I'm going to keep the Uwe Rosenberg vibes going here, it's Agricola, where you are going to live or die by your ability to get exactly the right move done at exactly the right time. And you've got your opponents that are going to be trying to hit those same spaces. And once those fences are gone, or once that wish for a child is gone, you're hosed until the next round comes around. And so it's so easy to have this player-to-player interaction that involves not combat or anything that aggressive, but just someone stepping into the space you want to be taking. And that is all you're doing. You're placing that worker every turn and then doing whatever that action is. And you've got to get the right spots in order to be able to make that work.
And this can be, to me, one of the most frustrating aspects of worker placement, Chris, where there's only that one or two spots. And if they're taken, then they're gone. And that action's not available to you until maybe you're the first player in the next round or something like that. So that can be an extraordinarily frustrating part of worker placement to me.
And fun part of it.
Yes. Well, and that's where the competition comes in, because, I think about A Feast for Odin, which is a great game, but there's less competition. At least it seems to me there's less competition because there are so many different paths to victory that you can find another way to work around your opponent. That's harder to do in Agricola, where there's only so many paths to victory, and you've got to get the right spots to make that happen. Really quickly, I'll just mention a nice offshoot that does the same basic type of action in a fun and varied way is a game that we reviewed just last week, which is Apiary. Now, there you're obviously placing a worker out there, but I think the thing that makes this deviate from the standard definition in a fun way is that there's not really competition. You can always move in and take a space, and it's actually beneficial potentially to move in and take a space after somebody does, because you're going to get the benefit of the power of their worker added to the benefit of your workers in some of the spaces. And it's also beneficial to the person who you're sharing that space with, because they're probably going to get their worker bumped off and increased in power, so that the next time they want to use that worker, they can do something that's even more exciting and more fun. So there's not so much competition, and there is less limitation on where you can put your workers, but there's an additional level of analysis in what benefit am I going to get by bumping this person, or what benefit am I going to give to the other player for bumping their worker. And I think that's a lot of fun, even if it's not exactly what you normally consider to be standard competitive worker placement.
I got one more variation I'm going to mention, which I wasn't planning to, but since you called that out, Chris, this is an interesting one, because I don't think you guys have played it, but that's Architects of the West Kingdom by Shem Phillips and Sam McDonald. And the idea here that there's a bunch of worker placement spaces, and you have 20 workers at the start of the game. I think it's 20. But basically, you can put a worker on any space in the board. Nobody blocks you. But there's two unique things that happen. One is that if you put a worker on a space you've already got a worker, it gets more powerful. So every worker you add there gets stronger. But also, there's a way for someone to go to an action that captures your workers and basically puts them in prison, and you have to unlock. You have to pay to unlock them. So it's risky. It's like you get a benefit for the more you put there versus being blocked out of a space. But if you go too far, somebody can capture them, and all of a sudden you're stuck without workers and have to take some actions to release them. So yeah, a lot of variations here. And I think when I looked at Board Game Geek's orthodox definition of worker placement, it literally said blocking is a key component of it. And here we're talking about a couple of games that are clearly worker placement, but don't use blocking. So again, an example of how it's evolved. Well, let's jump into our next term. And the term we're going to call out here is one that I think is really changed a lot, but one that people seem to get very excited about how accurate you are with it. And that term is 4X. So 4X is an interesting one. We talk about it all, that we use it referencing several of our favorite games that we talk about frequently. And this is probably one of the more obscure ones, because it means absolutely nothing in the language if you don't know why it exists. But there's some games that were created that use these four elements. And the four elements are exploring, expanding, exploiting, and exterminating. Hence the 4X's. Maybe it should have been 4Es. I don't know. But you get the point. These are generally space type of games or adventure type of games where you're revealing places on the board that you're exploring. Something's going to be revealed to you as you move about. Then you're going to expand. You're going to spread your forces. You're going to spread your fleets, whatever, around the map. Then you're going to exploit those locations. That means you can take resources from them. You can take something from the spaces that you've gone to, and you can exterminate the other players. You can literally wipe them off the map. That's what the 4X's meant, I guess, originally, or at least my understanding of them. And I'd say, for the most part, the games, when we say 4X, we're generally talking about games that do that type of thing. But I definitely feel like my terminology around it is much more flexible. Like, extermination doesn't have to mean that somebody can actually be eliminated from the game, because that would be a crappy game. Nobody wants to play a game with player elimination. But there are great 4X games where you can really impact somebody's game by attacking them and by pushing them out and stuff like that. So that's kind of how I feel about it. I think 4X is a term that is sometimes, and we'll probably get some hate on this one, but somebody will say, no, it has to have all 4X's to be called a 4X game. Or you'll mention a game and they'll say, that's not really a 4X, that's a 3X or a 3.5X.
Yeah.
Nonsense. That's nonsense. I'm going to give you an example that seems to raise a lot of conversation when it's called a 4X. And that's Scythe. Now, I tried to pick games today on my list that I don't mention too often, but there's a couple that were just such perfect examples. You'll have heard me talk about them before. So Scythe is a game where you are starting in kind of a country in Eastern Europe. It's a game about exploring the countryside. When you explore in this game, basically the only exploration that happens is that if you get to a space with an encounter token, you flip over a card that kind of shows you what that encounter looks like, what kind of resources you could get there. Is that exploration? To me, it is. It's fun. It's an exciting moment that happens when you get to certain spots on the board. Then you're expanding, you're moving, you're spreading out, you're moving your troops, you're moving your workers out on the board, and you're exploiting the land. The more you spread out, the more workers you get out there, the more they can take from the areas that you control, that you have people in. But can you exterminate in this game? I think you can. I think you can push somebody back far enough where they're basically out of the game. Yeah, they're going to have moves. That's good. That's a good thing. And so for me, this is a perfectly great example of a 4X game, even if it's not the original official example.
Yeah, Tim, you nailed the traditional classic orthodox definition of it right there. Nothing to add to your definition, but a game or two. I'm going to throw out just a couple games here. Then I want to come back after Chris is done and do some lightning round. Is this the 4X game or not with you? But Eclipse Second Dawn for the Galaxy is one that stands out for me as a very traditional 4X type of game. You're flipping over these galaxy tiles and seeing if you even want to explore that one. If you do, you get to put it out. And then later on, you might be able to expand in there, colonize and exploit those planets. And then you're going to either exterminate the non-player characters or NPCs, as they're called. So you're not really going after anybody, just somebody, a ship that's out there, but not Chris's or Tim's ship, just a generic board game provided ship. And but then later on in the game, you can go after Chris or Tim, or even right up front, you can go after your opponents in the game and try to exterminate them. I think Eclipse has this caveat where you can possibly get wiped out of the game, but then they have another system in place where you get to throw some ships back on there, or maybe not. Maybe you can just get totally wiped out in that game. It's really tough to do. You have to be really having a bad day for that to happen.
Well, you'd have to be playing with some real jerks to do that to you. Because once you're at a certain point, why would they bother attacking you still?
Yeah. So that was Eclipse, is my sort of orthodox, if I'm to steal from Chris, orthodox 4X game. And then I will use a sort of unorthodox one that could cross into a lot of other of these terminologies. Through the Ages, a new story of civilization. You're exploring here with different technologies. These political actions come out and these territories come out. That are you going to decide to dedicate resources to those? So again, you're expanding with these technologies that you're growing. Your whole little tableau is expanding. You're researching now journalism, which wasn't even part of your 4 original types of buildings, or sports arenas. So your whole civilization is expanding out that way. Who are you going to exploit in this? You have those territories a little bit. I want to say territories here and not colonies, because I'm going to stay out of that territory. But so you're going to exploit these little territories that you find out there that are resource heavy, and you're also going to exploit your opponents. If you have a stronger military than them, you can go after them and take some of their resources. And then the exterminate option, this strictly falls upon your other opponents. You can go to war with them. You don't necessarily eliminate them from the game, but there is that option to concede if they're just getting so battered. You might as well just exterminate yourself rather than stick around for 4 or 5 more turns of humiliation in this game. So Through the Ages is a sort of unorthodox 4X game for me.
All right, Adam, that was a gutsy move, I gotta say, because I was actually thinking about this list and I was trying to come up with what in the world would I call Through the Ages? I was thinking about that game, but it never occurred to me to throw that under 4X. So I love your creative thinking there.
I'll take it.
In terms of the definition, I mean, it's hard to argue with the definition that is actually contained in the name, the 4 X's, which are actually the 4 E's. And it really does come down to how many of those X's does it have to have before it can, legitimately be called one of those things, or how loosely do you interpret those terms before you can include a game. But my first reaction was actually exactly the same as yours, Adam. Eclipse. Eclipse is the 4X that I always think of as my go-to 4X. But I knew you were going to say that, so I wanted to do something a little bit different. And so I went with Space Empires 4X, which, I mean, that's got to be a 4X game, right? Because it says it in the name. It's in the name of the game itself. But I also think that it is probably about as good an example as you can get of a straight-up orthodox 4X game. I don't particularly like this game. It's not a particularly fun game, but it really does hit all those things. You're fighting, you're expanding, you're exploiting the resources of the planets, and you are exterminating people. One of the things that I actually like about this, the Explorer, I feel like part of the necessary requirement for the exploring is to have things be a little bit unknown. So you flip the tiles over in Eclipse, you do the same thing in Space Empires 4X, but you can also keep information about your forces secret as well. So people don't actually know what you might be sending at them until you engage with them. And so I think that's another interesting part that really kind of plays into the concept of the exploring, even though it comes into the context of the exterminating. So that's my orthodox example, but I want to push the boundary. I thought I was going to push it a lot with this one, but Adam, they pushed the boundary beyond where I'm going here. But my offshoot was Age of Innovation or any of the Terra Mystica universe games where maybe, I don't know if there are 2Xs, you're doing a little bit of exploring, but you're not gaining new information by exploring. You're not flipping tiles to find out what's in a spot. You're expanding, so you're trying to increase your footprint on the board. You're exploiting resources, but you're not exterminating really in any way. I don't think there's any way that you can interpret the exterminate into that game. But still, to me, it gives that kind of 4X feel with a bit of a resource management bent to it. So I think this maybe goes back to the evolution and how these things get mushed together. But I don't know. I mean, Age of Innovation or Gaia Project, is that a step too far? I mean, is that my Through the Ages?
I think it is a step too far, and I think it's a step further than Through the Ages. In fact, when Adam was explaining Through the Ages, I would have never thought about it as a 4X, but it does have all the elements in a way. I think Age of Innovation and Gaia Project, although they do the space exploration on a map thing, they really are. I think they're missing some of the key elements of what I would call a 4X. I would never say the Gaia Project's a 4X, even though it tries to feel like a space exploration game. So for me, it is a step too far, Chris, but I get where you're going with it. It's missing some of those key elements, probably the worst elements. That's why I love Gaia Project, right? The worst elements of one of these 4X games is the extermination and the exploration when there can be negative surprises. Like, the best part about Gaia Project is that you can make strategic decisions and you're not going to just lose ships because you flipped over the wrong tile, which happens in Space Empires 4X all the time. I hate that darn game. But yeah, I wouldn't call that one, Chris. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, Gaia Project, I think it's missing one of the X's, the exterminate one for sure. But I can see where you're going with it, Chris. I think that's a fun choice. So lightning round I'm going to throw in Fractal Beyond the Void as a recent entry. Tim, I think you're going to love this one. The combat is there. The exterminate is there. But you are very selective with your targets. And then when it does go to that combat, you have this whole deck versus deck situation, 8 cards, 1 card at a time. Have you built that deck well enough? You can just retreat your guys and still get a little benefit from that. So you might enjoy that one a little bit more with the exterminate section of that one. So that's a recent entry rivaling Eclipse for me in the 4X genre. Then I want to ask you guys about, I was going to mention Space Empires 4X. Do you have to, I think there's a few win conditions, but isn't it you have to exterminate your opponent to win, or your opponent just quits? I don't even.
That's the way I've lost every game of that stupid game. So I assume that's the
it's just depressing watching Steve come and sweep through my forces and there's 2 guys left and I'm like, ugh.
The worst part about it is that there's a certain point in the game when you know that there's no way. Like, there's absolutely no way you can come back and you have to spend another hour playing it. That's terrible. That's terrible. That's why exterminate should not be a key component of any game. Like, absolute extermination. There's got to be an opportunity to come back, or some other, scoring opportunity.
Yeah, Tim, that's when it gets to concede territory for me in Space Empires 4X. I'm like, Steve, you got this one. You mind if I quit? And he just goes, yeah, you better quit, Adam. This game's over. One of the most famous ones, Twilight Imperium, now 4th edition. I've never played this one. I like to play it. We've talked about that. Okay, is Risk a 4X game for you guys?
Well, I guess in a way, because there is exploration, right? When you move into a territory, don't you get some like random combat card that can potentially help you make a set in a future turn? I think there is.
No, you have to have you get that through combat.
Yeah, but that's okay. Fair enough. So it's not just moving into a territory, but every territory's got people on it. So in some way, winning a combat is what lets you do exploration. I think it would be as many X's at least as Gaia Project, Chris. So for me, I think Risk would somewhat qualify, but very loosely. Like, it's missing some juice, I think.
What about Mosaic, A New Story of Civilization?
Yeah, lightly, because the exploration is all visible on the board. I don't think there's much exploration there other than the cards you're going to get. And then the extermination is so rare. Like, you can occasionally do some things to impact your opponent's troops, but it's almost non-existent in there. So
it's subtle, right?
Probably less so than
Through the Ages.
Through the Ages, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then how about Revive? I think that might be missing one of the X's too, but to me, Revive approaches that 4X feeling.
Yeah, what? No extermination, right?
Not really. And I agree. I'd say it's almost slightly more than Gaia Project, only because I've actually been in moments where something that you revealed and kind of set yourself for, someone jumped in and took it. That can happen in Gaia Project too. You can really get blocked out of spaces. So I think in the same ways, the exterminate is, it's not really true attacking, no external. I don't think you could call that a 4X either. I think even just us flirting with the concept of Gaia Project and Revive on this list means that our whole episode is invalid and nobody's going to believe us anymore.
Oh my goodness. Well, I will concede that it is probably closer to 4X than my Gaia Project Age of Innovation one, just because those don't really have exploring either. So
yeah, fair enough.
We're just having fun with it.
Yep. All right, cool. Well, let's jump into the next one, and that is area control. So area control may be a little more straightforward, but probably worth mentioning here. Also, because I couldn't really find a true definition of it. And in fact, most of the games that I think of as an area control weren't even listed that way on Board Game Geek. My definition for area control is that controlling an area on a map is a key winning or scoring condition of the game. And so there are a solid amount of games that do that. My example was, again, a game I've talked about a lot because it was just such a perfect... It's the key game I think about, and that's Blood Rage. The idea being that moving into a space on a map doesn't mean you control it, but at some point you can pillage that area, or somebody can pillage it, and then there's a conflict that happens. But at the end of that pillage, there's only going to be one person left, and that person controls that space on the map, and they're going to get a benefit for it. So I don't even know if that's a great example. What do you guys think about area control? Anything you would add to my definition, or games that you think are a better example of area control?
Yeah, no, this is a tough one, and I think it's one of the ones that gets misused so often. And I think a lot of the times people think any game that involves fighting is an area control game, and that's not necessarily true. Like, here's an example. So Dune Imperium, it has battles and it has fighting, yet I would argue that it doesn't really qualify as an area control game. It's more of a worker placement type of game. Conversely, you do actually have to have some way of contesting specific areas. So it may not be combat, it may be some other thematic variation, but you do have to be contesting areas and not just owning them. So for example, going back to my Gaia Project variation, you're not fighting anybody there. You're controlling an area, but I wouldn't call that area control either, because there's no contestation of those spaces. So I think my definition probably tracks pretty closely with Tim's there. And the example that I have, the orthodox example, is also Blood Rage. But I actually was going to say, beyond Blood Rage, anything in Eric Lang's trilogy of Blood Rage, Ankh, and Rising Sun is an absolute perfect example of that type of game. And really, because in each of those games, the main thing you are doing is moving around a board, expanding, and attempting to control certain spaces through which you're going to gain the majority of the points. Now, some add more gewgaws and doodads than others within that series, but Blood Rage really is kind of the most distilled version of area control, I think, and that's why I think of it first on my list. But there's lots of games that have variations on area control that are a ton of fun, and I think still in some way reflect this mechanism. So a couple of other examples that I thought of. One is Scythe. You are actually attempting to control areas, and those certain areas will allow you to have certain benefits that come from your control of that area. And in addition, they also result in points based on the number of areas you control. Or you can get certain resources if you build, if you use your workers in those spaces that give you the resources that come out of that particular map space. Another one is Wonderland's War, where you have these battles at the end of each round, and in those battles you are fighting it out for control of a particular zone, and if you win that zone in the war, then you're going to get a certain number of points. Now, that one also varies a little bit, or differs a little bit from the orthodox definition, in the fact that you don't have to win battles. You don't have to go and do those things. So these, in similar to Scythe, you don't have to battle inside. You could win a game of that just by doing other things. So that's why I don't list those as my primaries for area control, but they do feature a very strong area control element, even if it's not the only element of the game.
Yeah, great thoughts, you guys. For my area control definition, I said it involves a map or locations where resources are dedicated to earn bonuses. Again, I try to go very succinct with this. You don't necessarily have to have a fight battle at the end, but usually that's how it pans out. Blood Rage was my prototypical example, just like you guys picked. That's the first one that came to my head, because of that great sort of battle at the end when you're having this card duel. That makes that game, puts it in the upper echelon of area control games for me. And then Wonderland's War, I had that as one of my picks as well. So you guys picked my main two. Another one I was going to throw in there, more so than any of these other little mechanisms, the area control gives me that almost auction or sort of attrition kind of feel where you're going to try to outlast your opponent in a certain area. At least it can. So here I was thinking about something like El Grande, where I'm going to dedicate all these little people to this certain area to see if I get the majority at the end. Well, Tim keeps putting people there too. And you know what? I'm not even going to be able to put enough guys there. I'm going to let that one go and move my attention to somewhere else. So he, sort of out auctioned me. And I've been attrited basically into looking at some other region on this map to go towards.
It's interesting you mentioned majority there, Adam, because that's another term that we hear a lot is area majority. And I think I tend to conflate the two, but there's probably a difference in that area control means that you get the benefit if you're the only one remaining in that region versus area majority like El Grande. Multiple people can be there, but you have to have the highest amount of strength, the most power, etc., to get the bonus, or maybe there can be a second place too. But those are two that I think I'll often just use area control. Now, I want to ask you guys about the term troops on a map, because usually when I think of area control, I think of I also sometimes will say a troops on a map game. What's the difference? Do you guys think that there's any difference between those, or there's some games that you would call area control versus troops on a map?
For me, I can think of Smartphone Inc., where it's sort of this area majority. If you have the most pieces on location, then at the end of the round, you're going to get this bonus that goes with that, a few more points. It's few exceptions that aren't necessarily about troops on a map. But yeah, in general, Tim, I do think about troops going in to control a certain region, or like in Wonderland's War, like you mentioned, Chris, it's you're putting your characters in that region to give you more bad draws out of your bag, essentially. So it's not about having the most troops there, but it's about being able to get the best point total out of your bag, really. So yeah, lots of times troops are involved in some way or another.
Yeah, and I think that troops on a map is a discussion of a game type. I think that area control is a mechanism. And like we've been talking about, you can have a game that has all kinds of mechanisms. A perfect example, Darwin's Journey, where we talked about kind of jokingly the area control or area majority element of putting stamps on a letter, right? I mean, that is an area control or area majority mechanism within a game that I would not in any way call a troops on a map game. But troops on a map does evoke a very specific thing. It evokes troops, well, I guess troops on a map. It invokes, armies out there fighting in a map that represents different geographic areas, kind of like, Blood Rage and Ankh and Rising Sun and a lot of those other kind of games that we've talked about. But I think that it is a different type of definition than the definition of a mechanism.
All right. Well, let's jump into our second to last term here, and that's going to be engine building. And engine building is an interesting one that always made sense to me, but I actually had mentioned this on social media at one point. I called out saying, hey, this is one of my favorite engine building games. And somebody retweeted and said, what the heck is an engine building game? So I thought this was a good one to call in here. So for me, an engine building game is a game where actions in the game allow you to make future actions or turns more powerful. That's kind of the way I think of it. I'm going to give an example that's a little weird because it's probably not the best example of engine building, but I think it makes a lot of sense. And that's It's a Wonderful World. It's a Wonderful World is a drafting game. What is drafting? Drafting is where you have a set of cards. In this case, anyway, it's card drafting. We'll go off into a tangent here. And you get to pick when you pass the rest of the person to the left of you, and then you get another set of cards. So in It's a Wonderful World, basically what happens is that as you pick up these cards and you build them, they create more resources that will allow you to build bigger and better cards on future turns. So kind of the whole goal of the game is to, in the first turn, build up a couple of cards. It will make you, the second turn, you can build up a couple more cards. And then the third turn, you're building up a couple more cards. So I think that's a really good example of engine building. There's a lot of games that do engine building in different ways, but I think that one is a clear escalation. If your second round isn't better than your first round, then you're going to lose the game for sure, right? You have to be growing in that game.
Yeah, some more great explanation and exposition there, Tim. I want to mention, your definition was very similar to mine. I simply said that your actions get stronger as the game goes on. So Terraforming Mars was a good example of this to me. If you want to play a card now in the fifth round, I have a $5 discount on this space card, and I can use all this titanium that I produced in the first 2-3 rounds. And now I'm producing 4 titanium per round instead of 0 in the first round. So now this card cost me $1 and 3 titanium. So I just did that. Now I want to put a city out there. Oh, that cost me only $20 because I have all these discounts. I get $5 back. So your turns go on and on and on and on. You get stronger. You get more money in the production phase every time in Terraforming Mars. So that's fun too. You feel stronger as the game goes on. Then I wanted to mention Fractal Beyond the Void. I've been mentioning it in every category on purpose here to illustrate the point that one game can encompass many of these different terms or definitions. But in Fractal, the same thing. You're increasing your ability to do actions more often, and your actions get stronger. So now recruit. Initially, you can only do 2 infantry, but later on, after you get a few military colonies out there, now you can get 3 infantries, or you can get a mech or a command ship. Then as you do more science colonies, so all the engine building here in Fractal is usually done by putting more colonies out there. So your research and your movement are related to science colonies. You get more science colonies, then your research and movement actions get stronger as the game goes on. And your government action is going to get stronger too as you build more influence through the first initial phases of the game. So that's another game that has this nice engine building in it, as well as these other area control and all the other engine building, area control. It's a 4X, no worker placement here in Fractal, which makes it, better than all these other games you guys are talking about. But just wanted to mention that one, as it does encompass a lot of these definitions we're talking about.
Yeah, my definition pretty similar to what you guys had talked about. I think the only real difference in my mind, or additional thing, was not just having stronger actions based on the things you do earlier, but potentially opening up different types of actions, which I guess is a way of making an action stronger too. So, but the example that I thought of as a pure engine building game, where engine building truly is at the very heart of it, and I actually think It's a Wonderful World is a great example of this, Tim. But mine was Space Base, where that is all engine building all the time. Every turn you're rolling a die, you're using those die and coins to buy different cards that you can slot in. And each of those cards is going to give you, it's going to be associated with a number or numbers. And in the future, every time you roll that die number, you're going to get the benefit on that card. So literally every turn, you are doing something that is going to build your engine, and you're trying to get the ones that are most likely to come up in the future, the numbers that are most likely to come up, and the ones that are going to provide you the best benefits that you're going to need down the road. And that's all you're doing. You're building that engine. And that game is it's a pretty midway game, because, in the end, engine building is not the kind of thing that lends itself to a big complex game, because it's a relatively simple type of mechanism within a game. So to have something that was a little bit more diverse and maybe not quite as oriented on the specifics of engine building, Scythe is a great example. That's a couple times now that I've mentioned Scythe, but there's a lot of stuff happening in this game. You're moving around the board, you're having battles, you're trying to explore, you're trying to build up your resources. But one of the things that you're doing is you're building up your capabilities, and you're getting the resources so that you can improve your player board. And as you improve your player board, it allows you to gain benefits from actions that you're taking or that other people are taking. Or it gives you the ability to put out a mech cheaper if you have a certain improvement built out than you did otherwise. And so you're doing a lot of engine building that's in service of all the other things that are happening in the game. So not straight engine building all the time like Space Base, but engine building that lets you accomplish the goals that you're trying to accomplish as you're moving around that map.
Yeah, Scythe is a great example, Chris, and it was one that because I just wanted to use it for 4X, I didn't use it here, but it would have been my first pick here. Anachrony is another game that Adam mentioned. Chris, you said engine building in itself is not that complex, but you can definitely use engine building in complex games, and Anachrony is a great example where literally the whole game is building up an engine so that you can do better actions without having to use as much resources and as much effort at the end of it. So great picks. All right, here's the most interesting term. And when we were chatting about this in our text thread, Adam said this is the most confounding term that we use all the time, and that's Euro. So Euro, it's a term that referred to, 20, 25, 30 years ago, the idea that European game makers were making a certain type of game. And that's kind of what it was known for. So especially, some of the early German game designs like Catan and other games being developed in Germany and then in Italy and other parts of Europe. So that's where it got the term Euro. But we often throw the term Euro out. But what does it mean? So I'm going to tell you what I think a good definition of a standard Euro is. Obviously, a lot of this has evolved again. My terminology usually involves resource management, minimum output randomness, It's mechanics first and theme secondary with multiple options to score points. Now I want to talk about output randomness. What does that mean? So you kind of have two types of randomness in games. So let me give you an example of output randomness. That would be a game like in Eclipse where you explore a tile, you flip it over, you've already invested the resources to go do that. You don't know what you're going to get. You flip it over and it could be something good. It could be something mediocre. You just don't know. So input randomness is there is randomness in the game, but you already know before you make a decision. So a great example of that would be something like Apiary, which we were talking about last week. There's a lot of randomness in what's in the market there. But before you decide to go and do a develop action or whatever that was, you already know what the options are available to you. It's not randomly dictated. So that's the difference between output and input randomness. And Euros generally have minimum output randomness. Usually you kind of know what your outcome is going to be before you make a decision in the game. And I want to talk about mechanics and theme here. So another thing that often refers to mechanics is you often hear Euros being dry Euros, right? The idea being that a Euro doesn't have a lot of theme. I think there are great Euros that have theme. In fact, some of my favorite Euros have interesting themes to them. But the reality is that most of the time the game is really what the game is, it's mechanics based. The theme is really indifferent. Like you could put a better paint of code on it and make it a more interesting theme, but it doesn't mean that the game has to have that theme to exist. And I think that's a pretty good example of Euros for me. I picked a game that I think is a good example of a dry Euro, and that is Trajan by Stefan Feld. Now, it's a really interesting mechanism set. It's basically this Mancala mechanism where you're going to pick up tokens and move them around a group, and then wherever you land, you're going to get a benefit in that space, and especially if it matches the tokens that are in there, you get an extra benefit. But it's so bland compared to what you're actually doing. Like that it doesn't tell you anything about what's happening on the board. So the theme isn't very important. It's really about the mechanisms there. And you kind of already know once you take that move, what your options are. You're not getting surprised by anything. And there's lots of different ways to get points, and you got to manage different resources as you're going around it. So I think Trajan's a good example of a classic Euro. My favorite Euros tend to be more thematic, things like Outlive I mentioned before. Things like Anachrony, things like Scythe. These are games that have Euro elements to them, but they put some theme on it and makes you feel like you're kind of doing the thing. So there's a variety there. What do you guys think about Euro? Do you feel like we're on the same page on this one?
I think so. First, a few things I want to say about the term Euro. I think Chris is going to jump on this bandwagon. It seems like a colloquial term. I like how you framed it, Tim, where it kind of originated from German game design, Italian games originated in Europe. So I tried to search Board Game Geek for this term, like what is a Euro game? And I couldn't find it. What I see now is games being labeled as economic or resource management. So what I think of when I hear that term Euro, which we've tried to kick that term from this show before, and it's tough to do, but I think of these efficiency puzzles, and like you alluded to, Tim, low luck or zero luck. So here games like Gaia Project. At the beginning of the game, it's all laid out. You've got all your options there, and it's just a choice of factions and then how you want to proceed throughout the game. There's really zero luck after that initial setup and organization of the game. Then I was thinking Power Grid is one of these old school kind of streamlined efficiency puzzles where there's a little bit of an auction and you're deciding how many resources to dedicate to this thing up front to sort of build your engine to turn that into points at some point. Brass Birmingham, the number one game on Board Game Geek at the moment. You have this card and network restricted actions where you're going to spend your money and black and orange and beer resources, again, all in service of trying to gain points and figure out this puzzle better than your opponents. And then I've already mentioned Terraforming Mars. That has some luck in the little search through the deck of cards that you're not going to make it through that entire deck in a game. So you're hoping you get the right cards. So a little bit of randomness there, but then you're trying to deal with what you got in the most efficient way to get more points than your opponents. So those are some examples of the economic resource management type of games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I would say, Adam, that I agree. Like I said, minimum output randomness, but there are some great Euro, like what I would consider a Euro that have output randomness. A great example is Viticulture. Mm-hmm. Viticulture is through and through a Euro game, but many of the actions you take, you don't know what you're going to get. It has to do with these decks of cards that you're going to get. So that's an example of definitely output randomness. Your actions, you may or may not get something useful for you, but it's not a major dictator of the game generally. Although some people I think would say that that is a bad Euro, like that they don't like that in their Euro games. Personally, I enjoy it, but I think it's a good point with Terraforming Mars too. You definitely, it's going to be a little bit dictated by the luck of what you get and trying to work with it.
Well, and there's a lot of irony in that part about luck, because when you look at any list of classic Euro games, what's going to pop up? Catan, right? I mean, that is like one of the OG Euro games, if you're using that term. And there is so much luck in Catan. I mean, every turn, whether you live or die, is based on a dice roll. Now, you can get the probabilities there, but, and there is so much luck involved in that game that, it's hard to say that that's determinative.
Does that make Risk a Euro then, Chris?
Maybe it's area control. I don't know. Worker placement. Yeah, so I will come right out and say I am deeply biased against this term, and call me a crazy lefty, but maybe it's just a bit too culturally biased for me at this point.
Yeah.
I think this is a term that has outlived its usefulness. Eurogame is the kind of thing that, to me, like, that might be a turnoff to some people who are like, yeah, Euro isn't something I'm going for. I may not be from Europe. I may not be of European descent. That's not something that's going to draw me in. And at this point, I don't even think it's really descriptive anymore, because the great games of this type are not even necessarily coming from European designers or coming out of Europe, like maybe they were way back in the day when this was kind of a new phenomenon. And it truly was that these games were coming out of Europe. Now you've got plenty of American designers that are doing those same kind of determinative, non-luck-based, chunky resource management games that it's not really, I think, appropriate to call them Euro games anymore. So to me, I think my definition, I think I looked up the same kind of definitions that Tim was talking about here, all those same things about the luck and the theme being loosely tied to the gameplay and all of that. When I think of Eurogame now, I have a bit of a biased view, and I actually picture in my mind something that probably has pretty lousy artwork, probably something that looks a little bit old and out of date, probably something that's going to be dry past the point of being palatable to me. So I don't think that is in any way necessarily a definitive definition for the masses of a Euro game, but it is kind of what I think about when I think about these games. Now, having said that, we're also trying to think of good examples of these games and ones that are actually fun. And that is not actually that hard to do. And I'm going to mention A Feast for Odin for the second time tonight. Tim mentioned it the first time, but this is the one that I thought of as a great Euro style game.
I thought you were going to pick something fun, Chris.
I love Feast for Odin, and isn't that ironic? But
that's okay. I picked Trajan, and I don't think that's very fun either. So,
but Feast for Odin is all of those things, and it even has kind of the bland artwork and a not terribly exciting theme. Yet it is still a game that I love, and it's a game that's very enjoyable to me, and it meets all of those qualifications. But I also do want to kind of step outside, as I've done with these other categories, and give one that I think pushes the boundary a little bit. And for that one, another second time mention for the evening, it's Barrage, which incidentally was designed by European designers, but it has tons of theme. The theme is deeply interwoven into the mechanisms of the game. It is not terribly luck-based. It's pretty determinative. There's some luck in what cards are going to pop up in the market row, and if you're playing with the market row. But it does have that same kind of competition for spaces that you see in the worker placement games we've been talking about, which seems to be a standard affect within most of the Euro games, that kind of a worker placement activity. And I think it meets all the other qualifications. It just kicks it out of the park. Hits it out of the park, kicks it out of the park, whatever. It's out of the park with terms of the excitement level and pushing things with theme and integrating theme in gameplay. So even though it meets the requirements, I think technically of a Euro game, it does not feel to me like what I would call a Euro game.
Yeah, I think the problem with is that we haven't found another term that's descriptive enough. And saying resource management is like, that is an element of what you're doing in most of these games, but you do resource management. I mean, even Blood Rage has action point selection, which is a resource you're spending. So it's really hard to just say resource management and to get the term across. And that's kind of the point of all this terminology, right? We use it to try to be succinct and try to just get to the point about something. Euro is probably the most stretchy in that, like you said, it doesn't really mean what it was intended to mean originally. And and it's such a wide variety. It encompasses so much. I still have a hard time getting away from using it when a game feels like a Euro to me. It feels a bit dry. It feels a bit mechanical. It feels a bit dry. And I know that, it kind of meets the description that I said. So I'm still looking for that perfect terminology to replace it, which is why I'm the one that often still uses it here. But yeah, well said, Chris. I think it's a good point that sticking geography on something that isn't geographically located, like relevant anymore, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Well, Tim, I think that's a perfect statement of the problem, that we don't have a term that replaces that. And so we really ought to have a term that you can replace that with, because the term ceases to be useful when you say it to Tim and it means one thing. You say it to Adam, it means another. You say it to me, it means something different. I mean, we're talking about a Feast for Odin and Gaia project in the same breath. And to me, those games have so little in common that, I'm not sure how useful a term like that is anymore.
Yeah, and the reality is that a lot of games are very hybrid compared to what they used to be when that term was around too. Like, I happen to use it. I was thinking about this last week. I mentioned this several times as I was talking about Sleeping Gods. And it was probably dumb for me to even say it, but I said several times, this is not a Euro game. But it was because it was very different than what I typically am looking for in a game, which is, minimum output randomness, minimum luck. Thematics don't matter as much. It's the opposite of it. So what do I say if I'm trying to refer to one or the other? And that's why I'm still falling back to that old term. Maybe we'll find something. Maybe we'll settle into something that makes a lot of sense. Maybe we need to come up with something. Let's create our own vernacular and create something that we just keep using until it sticks. I don't know. Probably not likely to happen, but maybe that's what we got to do. All right. Well, that will wrap up our board game dictionary episode. If you liked the episode, let us know. Or if you didn't, let us know. There's obviously a lot of terminology we could go into like this. It's a fun conversation for me. I think Adam and Chris would agree with me that this is fun talking through and thinking about it. So if you enjoyed it, let us know. Maybe we'll come back and do another one down the road a little ways. Otherwise, hit us up on social media if you want to hang out, chat with us, get involved in our poll results. We've got a Facebook group. That's where we ask the poll question, but we'll also put the question out on our Blue Sky account. If you'd like an invite to Blue Sky, you can reach out to me at tim@boardgamehottakes.com, and I'll be happy to share an invite with you. If you like the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. I was told that we've gotten some reviews coming in this week since my request last week, but I don't have them to read yet. How sad is that? So don't leave us hanging every week. We got to have at least one review to read every week. Until next week, take care, everybody.
Good night, all.
Bye-bye.
I loved it.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
That was my favorite part of the last episode.